Hey everyone, welcome back to another roundtable discussion here at LudoNarraCon. I am Patrick Klepek, an editor over at Remap. You might be familiar with my work at Remap, at Waypoint, at Giant Bomb, at Kotaku. I've been doing this since I was 14 years old. It's far too long. I should stop, but unfortunately I have no other talents. And so I desperately have to surround myself with people more talented than me to make it all feel worth it. And so that's what we're going to do today. We have a roundtable discussion talking about how do you weave narrative into gameplay? How do you balance between the two? Where are the tensions? How do you kind of explore those tensions? How do you go between those two different worlds? And in order to unpack that, I have gotten together a fantastic group of developers who talk through the idea generally and also how it specifically has impacted their projects as they've been working through them. And so we have developers from Cryptmaster, Nirvana Noir, and WanderStars here to walk through this today, and I'm going to introduce you to them right now. From WanderStars, a game where you follow the story of Ringo and Wolf as they join forces to collect the pieces of the WanderStar map in this turn-based RPG with roguelike elements. Use words to create your own fighting techniques, befriend your rivals, and explore the universe in an adventure inspired by 90s anime. Andy Gallo, lead artist and 2D artist on WanderStars, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited. I'm so happy to be here with you all.
And then from Cryptmaster, a game where you say anything in this bizarre dungeon adventure where words control everything. Fill in the blanks with text or voice to uncover lost abilities, embark on strange quests, and solve mind-bending riddles. Can you conquer the crypt and uncover the mystery at the heart of Cryptmaster? We have writer and co-designer of Cryptmaster, Lee Williams.
Hello, it's lovely to be here in such great company. Thank you very much.
And last but not least, we have from Nirvana Noir, a noir adventure beyond time and space. The city of cosmic beings is under threat in two parallel realities. One where the Big Bang was never fired, the other exploding in color and sin. It's up to you to solve the mysteries of the Bigger Bang in this follow-up to the award-winning Genesis Noir. Evan Stark, producer on Nirvana Noir, thanks for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Patrick. I'm really glad Fellow Trevor brought us all together because I like where we're going with this talk so far. I'm digging it.
Well, so I think I want to start just very basic, but I expect that the way this is explored in each of your projects is different. Is just this idea of narrative and gameplay, how they interweave, how you think about the tensions between the two, and maybe let's start with you, Andy, on WanderStars. Like, how do you think about those two ideas, and how have you kind of thought about them as you've been developing WanderStars?
Sure, absolutely. It's interesting that you're mentioning tension because I definitely feel like they are opposing forces, gameplay and narrative, which is funny because in WanderStar's case, it all started with the gameplay. We have this what we consider unique world building mechanic, and we took from that and basically built a world in which the gameplay mechanic is actually the magic system for that world, which is called Ki, which is inspired by martial arts. So as the development went on, we realized that the story we were making basically took a life of its own, and it became like clashing a little bit with the gameplay. So the way we figured out how to make it work was to basically structure the story of our game like a TV show. Like, our influences are very much inspired by anime, especially 90s anime that we grew up with. So the structure for the game is actually 10 episodes, and what you would consider like a traditional level for a traditional game is actually structured like a TV episode. So we have acts, and we have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And within the episode, we have that struggle of, okay, we have to start off with some gameplay to get the player engaged, but then here we have a cutscene where we're going to establish the characters and their motivations and what they're going to do. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of tension, and it's a constant struggle, but the way we've managed to balance that is with the episode structure.
Evan, how about on Genesis Noir?
With Nirvana Noir, we took a lot of obviously, like, there were a lot of things we wanted to see come true from the first game. So then part of those concepts is the idea, and this is where, like, we ran into really early trouble early on because we were really excited about the possibilities, and then you look at something like the Butcher interaction that's available in our demo, and the opportunity to create any word is an extremely massive problem. Like it's far too large. You really can't give people that much freedom, and it's like one of the things about Wander Stars that I really dug is like you chose a very specific series of words. Like yes, there's like so it's like the violence word or the action word, and then the modifiers on it are also like very fun and very tight around the styling of the lead character and like how she would probably describe her activities, and I love that interplay. For us, it was like with particularly the butcher interaction, we wanted it to feel, and we want the game to feel generally like you are literally taking these concepts and then reordering and putting them in different, placing them and like enacting with them in a way that I would say like upends or is not typical conversational methodology, is not usually like your RPG stuff. But we're trying, like in trying to do that, you end up with like a really big pit and a lot of understanding about why anyone does language and tells the story the way that they do. And then we're kind of like reverse engineering from all those failures, something like the butcher interaction, which we have a very tight series of letters that arrive. You can rearrange them and then end up with something new. But like you're also getting another set of letters from grinding the text box that the butcher character is talking with. So like we want you to like fundamentally feel like you were like really getting at these words, and there's other interactions later on that we're trying to feel out and see there. Like we're trying to balance, honestly, like trying to figure out a gameplay mechanic that fits the idea that we're originally going in with. We tend to be very like first level is narrative, and then we go through all the technical possibilities and then all the no's that we couldn't possibly make happen, and then we retrofit some kind of like version of the original narrative that we're really happy with. And then it kind of comes out in something, again, very beautiful and unexpected in a way that like you can't plan it to go in. And that's been the most surprising thing, I think, is how much it fights being planned.
Lee, how about on Cryptmaster?
Yes, it's really interesting to hear what Andy and Evan both said just then, because I think we face some very similar issues, and I've had the chance to check out both Nirvana Noir and Wander Stars, and it's really interesting to see how elegantly both of those games tackle a lot of the similar situations as we encountered in making Cryptmaster. I think we had a similar problem to the one, Evan, you were just describing, that if you give players too much freedom, you're making a rod for your own back in some ways. It's very hard to manage that, so you need to find nice ways of putting limits on that. I was saying to Andy earlier, we started with a system which wasn't 100 miles away from what Wander Stars does, so much better than the way we would like to do it, where we would use adjectives and nouns, and we ended up we couldn't make that idea work, and we moved into using letters more, something maybe a little closer to what happens in Nirvana Noir. But I was in awe of how well Wander Stars basically does what we failed to do really nicely with the adjectives and the nouns. And as Evan said, it's a great way of handling of keeping the scope of your narrative, if you like. But I think one thing we found was that there was tension between gameplay and narrative, but we were able to manage it. And I would imagine maybe this is something we've all got in common. We were able to manage it largely because we've got a very small team. So in my case, it was just myself and Paul, and we just hash it out every day. That any issues we have, we were able to do it in quite a granular way. I don't think you would be able to make the same. It would be much harder to make games like these games where the gameplay and narrative are meshed so closely together. It'd be much harder to do that with a larger team. We were able to. I mean, one of the things in Cryptmaster, the way the story advances is. There's this sort of hangman guessing game where you fill in the skills of your characters, and those skills also basically tell the stories of the characters as you go through. Well, we were able to go through it in a really granular way, so that for every skill we see about how many letters does this word need to have, because that determines its difficulty. What's its actual function going to be in the game? It needs to be tied to that. Also, it needs to be tied to advancing this character's story, a memory that will advance their story. So we were able to have that kind of to and fro. It wasn't painless always, because often Paul and I might be at odds with what we wanted that skill to do. But we were able to work through it kind of step by step. And that's an advantage of having a really small team. I think in our case it was.
Did the two of you, Evan and Andy, find that the small team dynamic also contributed to an ability to sort of figure these problems out, or at least arrive at an idea of a solution faster than, you might like the idea of having tens of millions of dollars, 150 people to outsource, different sorts of work to, but I think what Lee is getting at here is like a very real issue, which is the ability to just, hey, by the end of this hour, we can come to a decision on something and move forward. Especially for games where you're balancing between these two, as you said, Andy, kind of opposing forces. And the more people that can speak up about it, perhaps the tougher it's going to be to arrive at some sort of resolution, even if it's the wrong one, right? Even if it's one that players push back on, but it's at least a resolution, which is probably harder and harder the bigger the team is.
Yeah. Do you want to go first, Evan?
No, take it.
Okay. Sure. Oh, we're just gonna gush about each other's games right now.
Yeah.
I just wanted to add. Actually, to answer your question, Patrick, the one thing I wouldn't outsource is the story. Of course, at times, being such a small team, I desperately wanted somebody else to just like show it and like for them to give me their opinion. But we have our resources are so limited. So I found this neat little trick that, might help other people, is that the best feedback that I get is the feedback of me from the future, which is, I started writing the story for Wonder Stars in 2021. So that was a very long time ago. So I've had the benefit of just like getting out of that tunnel vision and just let some time just pass and then come back to some things that I wrote at the beginning and looking at it with fresh eyes, like, oh, okay, so maybe this isn't the tone that I was going for, or maybe this character's motivation don't make sense. So, I think that's a nifty little trick that you guys can apply for yourselves.
Just make the game for many, many years, and then you can look back on it and go, hey, that's not any good. What was I doing there?
Yeah. I guess I have to add that I feel like games, like, at least that's our case. Like, I feel very privileged in the sense that we don't have to lock the script. Like once we go into production, I was talking about how our game is structured in episodes, and basically we just lock in once we start developing one episode. So we go in, we finish, like the script for the episode, we move on to storyboards, and then it's like, okay, so now we're locked in for this episode. But, like we have all the other episodes that as we go along, maybe we realize that coming from this previous episode, we actually should try a different tone for this one, or maybe like a different location. So we had a lot of freedom in that sense to, just let some time pass as development went on, just look at it with fresh eyes.
I definitely hear that 100%. And it goes to the heart of the small team is like, it's really easy to only tell like 4 or 5 other people, hi, this thing we're doing, it's completely different now. It was mandatory. We rewrote it from the ground up, but it's because like we finally thought through what the character should be. And then finally that informs like the top level narrative that we actually end up presenting, because we figured out that mechanical middle that we originally thought we had a great idea for. And upon implementing, we're like, oh, no, we have to rewrite it all. And that's fine. Like, again, it works with a small team because you can put the brakes on and you can say, hey guys, it's not working, and we're going to take the best parts of it, and we're going to end up retooling it, and it's going to be beautiful. And every time we've done it, it really, truly has been. But I can't imagine doing that with something that like is a larger behemoth where you have to ask so many more people to change their conception of this piece of the game. And even with the size of team, we're still running into those like the moments where I have to come back and have to say, hey, I know we just were talking about this for 15 minutes. That doesn't exist anymore, and I'm very sorry. But we really we changed that 6 months ago, and we need to like go rethink about how the rest of the game follows from that.
I think one thing that we're touching on here is, and I think will be very present over the course of LudoNarraCon, is like, Cryptmaster already has a demo out. I know that the two both Nirvana Noir and Wander Stars are planning to have demos as well. Like once you have players involved, right? Like when it goes from theory to practice to like it's out in the real world, seems like that's kind of really where the rubber meets the road on, like, well, this is how we think that what player, you can test with the people around you. You can do these focus tests with like friends and family, but like once thousands, tens of thousands of people start hammering away at your game, it really starts to put that into stark contrast. And so, Lee, you've already had Cryptmaster out there with people playing it. So I wonder if you've experienced moments in watching people kind of pull and push at the game where, hey, this is sort of what we were intending with the mechanics and the narrative, and it turns out people are like doing something else, or they took it a completely different way. Like, how has that process gone so far with your game?
It's been, in our specific case, it's been incredibly useful to start having players. When the demo was out first for Steam Next Fest, and we just spent the week watching people playing it, and because you can type anything at any time, I'd already managed to second guess quite a few words that players would try to put in first. But there were additional ones, and there were loads. I cleared my desk up this morning, but I did have a piece of paper here which was just covered with tiny writing of every word that somebody said that I'd forgotten to put a response for or to add to a pool so that it could be taken into account, and I just noted everything down. So it was a really, really useful experience for us, I think, to get that feedback. And the other thing, which is I think is common for every game, is just the tutorial aspect of the game. As soon as you start getting feedback on it, you just, when you're working again, and in a small team, this is probably a unique difficulty, that when you're working in a little bubble, just 2 or 3 of you, it's easy to overlook the things that people will miss, the things that people will not understand, the things that people will do that you didn't expect them to do. I guess in a larger team, you don't have that risk to quite the same extent. So, the feedback was hugely useful for us.
Go ahead, Evan.
We took our tech lead, Jeremy, took our demo to PAX East, and the sheer dump of information that he brought back just from watching people, he just was like, and he just religiously would watch every one of them, and he had there were things we needed to get around in the demo and some spiels about like how things worked and what didn't, and it was that's the first time we've had a rigorous amount of playtesting for something that we put out that was as polished as we wanted it to be. And holy mackerel, it's so clutch, because even though this is literally from like an even more basic just like game design thing, is like, okay, how much space did we give them to go literally do whatever they want to? What did they do? What were they interested in? What kind of literally just what activities in this small little thing that we provided did everyone participate in? And then when they got to the actual puzzles, which are not something that we have made a lot of, as far as like especially linguistic puzzles, like how did everyone do it? And it was like absolutely two extraordinarily validating moments. One in that they got the writing and they enjoyed the writing, and it also led them to thematically where we were going with what was happening. And then when they got to the actual interaction itself, they blew through it and they understood it, and and that was like, oh yeah, we're not on a different planet here. We actually have a capacity for delivering hints and delivering like an idea, and the feedback and all of that functions. And like those were such massive like crazy like limiters and things that we like after we had built the thing we kind of want to, and then we have to really mold it so that someone who's a player can actually understand what's going on. And like that whole process being validated at PAX was massive, and we need to do I'm so glad to see 100 times more of that, and I hope that people send us a lot of emails and a lot of feedback on how things are or are not working, because this is one of our more complicated ones, and if we can do this right, I think what's going to follow is going to make a lot of sense too.
Andy, have you had any experiences with Wander Stars, kind of getting in front of people, and it's surprising what people did to break apart the systems that you had built?
Well, it's actually kind of funny because we haven't had a public demo out yet. I think it's going to be out at the time this is public. But we've had, of course, internal testing. And the thing we had to polish the most was actually tutorialization. And I'm going to take this opportunity to gush about the other games. I think Nirvana Noir and Cryptmaster are super intuitive and easy to just jump in and play. But actually, for the people who playtested Wonder Stars for us, we had to like really explain the combat system because at the end of the day, we have that RPG turn-based combat, and there's a lot of like synergies that are not super obvious, like the first, especially if you're not coming from similar games. So we actually had to like sit down and see like, okay, how do we make this friendly? How do we make this, fun to learn? And that's how we came up with the tutorial that we have right now. We have an announcer, like the anime announcers and stuff, and we just try to make it fun.
I'd say it succeeded.
Thank you.
Big fan.
It wasn't. That's
Really dug it.
a relatively new addition to the game. Tutorialization actually comes like really late in the game.
The announcements were a perfect device for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. It's very similar. Or very just a quick moment. It's really exciting seeing that, and then also like someone who's like really guiding you. And it's something we struggle with a bunch because we don't have like the typical noir trope of like No Man's inner voice, where his inner monologue, where he's talking. You literally could talk. He could talk you through, but we're trying to figure out how that fits given like the style of game and how much conversation and how much like non-conversation we want to have. Interacting particularly with the Cryptmaster, Lee, was like an absolute riot because it's just, and it's like you, and I'm blown away that you took on the challenge of opening yourself up to like literally all of the possible words that you could have, and then that's in part the tutorial, like going into a chest and you don't do well, and he's like, well, that's too bad, and you're like, oh no, I have to take this. Okay, all right, that's fine, I understand. Thank you, Cryptmaster, for giving and taking. The both of those like they seem to have,
was
like,
a point.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was going to. All I was going to say was that there was a point at which I regretted that. It probably wasn't the right choice to just let people type anything, but I think hopefully we managed it in the end to cover most things.
There's a point about failure states that we actually have struggled with a bunch because like we don't have a point where if you lose that we have like there's not like a real compelling like narrative to that necessarily. So like it's the detective persists, and like the kind of failure state is like you don't necessarily know what's going to happen next. But it's not like with that in particular, I thought it was actually a really good way to get your player to say, well, if you want to succeed. I went so long without Sid having jab that was only at the very end of the like literally the end of the demo, and I'm like, well, I have 2 useless characters and this is not easy, and I'm suffering for that accordingly. I've brought that upon myself, and that's fine. I think that there's funny moments with that, and like this is where like you see like in the narrative, is it useful to have that gameplay failure? Can you actually incorporate that into your narrative? And I think that like Cryptmaster did it really well, and I don't think Wander Stars is the game where you're gonna like completely get your butt kicked, but I was really curious to see like eventually how far that can go, and like what more difficult, and what like, because the rule system is really rich and it's really a lot of fun. And I was like really getting into like all the adjectives and like all like the element matching and like the different weaknesses and playing into that. And I'm really like, it feels like there's a really high ceiling for like the difficulty and like the fun kind of intricate. I have to tailor what I'm doing, and I can't do the same thing every time. And then you end up with these really funny sentences, which are like really wonderful for that.
Thank you.
And I think Nirvana Noir does a very good job as well of encouraging that kind of experimentation. In the Butcher's segment that I played earlier, it's really nice that the first word, I can't remember what it was now, but I could only think of one thing to go in there, the 3-letter one, or there were a couple, but then as it expands, you suddenly think, oh, actually there's one where it was power. I use power, but I thought actually there's 3 or 4 other things I can get from this, and the way it allows you to pause and keep trying different words is really nicely done. Again, it just eases you into that sort of that experimental frame of mind when you realise there's a lot of things I could try out here, and that's a really nice thing to give to players, I think.
It's so funny that you mentioned power, because I actually didn't I put prowl. And then I was like, why did I put power?
Yeah.
We literally have gone through a lot of like back and forth and whether or not we're going to go with the 3 and 4 letter words in the larger one, because at some point it gets multiplicative and not in a fun way. And you think like as a player, like, and that's like a designer. Like, do I want to hang my player out in a limb like that, where they're going to have to literally like at some point you feel like you're just guessing, and that's not necessarily as much fun. You want to feel like your intuition and like your narrative following along is getting rewarded in that sense, which I'd say like both your games also do that in a really fun way. WanderStars, particularly like the elemental system and like watching like different teenagers, and also like even like the rewards for like the surrender system, or like the peaceful ending with everything is really
The
nice.
pop-ups. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One thing I think is interesting about these three projects is I wonder what the origin story is for the three of you on was the narrative first, and then mechanically what makes sense for the story we want to tell, or was we came up with this system, this kind of design idea first. What's the framework we put on top of it? Lee, like where did it start with Cryptmaster?
Ours was definitely mechanics first. The original story we had was about pirates. We had a pirate ship, and I can't think now, it's something to do with a captain. You would have a pistol, you would shoot words out of sentences when people spoke to you. You would shoot the words out of their sentences to make the meaning change the sentences, which is a lovely idea, but it turns out it's not fun. It's not very much fun at all. So gradually that changed. And then we had a thing which I was comparing with Andy earlier to WanderStars, but was quite different. Again, we didn't pick up on the right direction for it. So you would pick from descriptions of your surroundings. You would pick words. You would be able to steal adjectives and nouns and then combine them to do things. Again, we couldn't get that to work with pirates, so we changed to dungeon crawling for some reason. Then, that was right. You would pick things from descriptions. So you'd have a sort of dungeon master who was saying, "Here's a rusty key." You would take the word rusty off it, and you would make your sword. I don't know why you would make your sword rusty, but you could do that. I kind of changed.
Oh, you're trying to poison them or something when you attack them. Like now,
that's it. Exactly.
You don't want to get stuck with rust. That hurts.
Yes, yeah. So it was that sort of thing, and then we couldn't get that to work properly either within the dungeon set. It wouldn't play with the other mechanics we wanted to do, and then we got the system of letters. I won't bore you with all of it, but it went through so many different iterations until we arrived at what we have now. And at a certain point, I remember I just stopped. I just made myself stop writing story, stop writing dialogue for it, because we just throwing out too many things, and Paul was doing the same from his side with the art. We thought no, we just, until we get the mechanics down, let's hold fire on everything else. And then when we got it working mechanically, it all began. Then we could just build the story, the art, everything else around it. So for us, it was very much mechanics first.
Andy, how about WanderStars? Like what's kind of the origin story on the narrative and mechanics for that project?
Oh, it's very similar to Cryptmaster. I think I was saying earlier that the gameplay, like we build the world around the gameplay, and we actually came up with this maxim that we used during development, which is gameplay is king, because it's so much easier to write around the gameplay than to have to justify or like make up gameplay for the narrative. So at first, like Kay, our game designer, he was coming up with prototypes and testing, and everything came out very organically from that first prototype. So first was the world building mechanic, and it was like, oh, what does this remind you of? Like, this is so anime, like the anime that we used to watch. Like they have this very long attack that they call out when they're going to, like shoot a beam or something. And it was just very organic. So on one side we have Kay, our game designer, like testing the prototypes and stuff, and then the other side there's me, like writing this whole mythology and this world and like this universe in which the gods gave the human beings the spirit to speak out the words and change reality. Like it's two very different processes, but it's very much informed by the gameplay, 100%.
Evan, I don't want to be presumptuous, but given how like visually spectacular like the projects your studio has worked on, like is gameplay king, or is gameplay often intent like with the story? Like I wonder how that applies to your project in particular, just given the fact that when you talked about how you sort of the team conceptualizes gameplay interactions, it's often here's the scenario, here's what we want the player to feel, how can we find meaningful interactions or puzzles within it?
Yeah. You got me 100%. A lot of the place where we're coming from Genesis Noir is not just like the kinds. It's like Genesis Noir is very indicative of the kinds of interactions we want to build, and it's a lot of like instead of building a game that has like a consistent gameplay loop that is based around like your combat or based around like the way in which you're doing that. Instead, we like having these little vignettes. We like having these little moments, if you will, and we just call them interactions because they could literally be anything, and we're really constantly hammering out what we want to do with those. But yeah, it's like coming from Genesis Noir, there was a story that we wanted to tell. There were themes we wanted to touch on, and then we decided we're going to go, one more dimension. We're going from 2D to 2.5 through 3D, and then we're going to. Then we did conceive of the story. We brainstormed a lot of different fun ways that we would like to consider interacting with things, attach those to narrative elements that they fit best with, like literally grinding the interaction with the butcher. That's 2 years old at this point. It was one of the first ones that we thought of, and it just like needed a lot of refinement, but also it just proved to be very tricky. So then again, the narrative like a little bit of a sandwich, and it's a multi-layer sandwich depending on how the next design level fails, and depending on how the next narrative level isn't quite right, and we keep going. But then it's always that last layer of narrative to help make the whole thing feel cohesive. So yeah, I don't ever want to say gameplay isn't king, but it's definitely like not our focus. Like it's not the biggest.
It feels like the balance is different, right? Like, and that's what makes, I think, Genesis Noir and Nirvana Noir unique, is that like it's not that gameplay doesn't matter. I'm certainly not trying to imply that, but that just like the ratio, like the formula is just a little bit different on what you're trying to present.
Yeah, we lead often with art, we lead often with pieces of narrative, but even themes before narrative. And if those kinds of moments can lead you to the place that we want you to get, then that's going to be enough. And there are points where even like looking forward to what the game is becoming, because that's how the development process works. We're going to probably take some of the ambitious gameplay things that we wanted to do, and we're going to tone them down a bit, but also in a way that like still lets the themes really sing through and lets you still feel like you're getting the story and that you are participating in like the unraveling of the mystery as No Man. Because that's the biggest like feeling, is we have these bigger pieces of the story, and the gameplay like has to make you feel like you're earning it, but that's like its biggest job.
I think what's interesting about Nirvana Noir in particular is, unlike Wander Stars and Cryptmaster, it's a sequel, right? Like, you are building off of a world, like whole development systems, production pipelines that you worked on and established, made sense of during that first game. Like, approaching this idea of like, hey, obviously this game, the second one is more ambitious. It's got different ideas, but like it's playing in similar spaces. In terms of trying to accomplish that goal of like that tension between story, coming up with gameplay ideas, just from a production standpoint, like what did the studio take away from building that first game? And was like, hey, we should do it this way on the second one from the start, as opposed to stumbling your way into these ideas and production styles, for the second one.
I'm not going to say we didn't learn from the first game, because there was a lot of really wonderful things that we took away from like the way that art leads, the way that like how are we going to compartmentalize these gameplay moments. But there's a lot of the ambitiousness that made a lot of the lessons from the first game not quite as applicable as maybe we would have liked. But nonetheless, I can definitely like the feeling is like the power of letting theme lead, I think actually is like really funnily one of the big takeaways, where we found that there were so many moments in Genesis Noir that people really resonated with. And like, we are trying to the word sequel is a little bit of a scary one for us, because we're trying to not make people feel like they need to play the first game. It's an antecedent, but it isn't necessarily all that related, or necessarily, it sets up certainly Nirvana Noir, but it doesn't, it's not mandatory. It does not the only like the driving plot like comes all the way through Genesis Noir. They feel pretty standalone, and that's like was a lot of our intent, is to make something that more robust in that direction. But then like it means then that we're kind of like retreading old ground, but we're definitely taking way different steps with it. So for our production process, we found ourselves still doing the kind of thing where there's so much value in bouncing back and forth, whether it's letting art lead and then letting narrative lead and then letting design lead and then letting art lead again. That was a thing that happened very subtly in the first game that we are absolutely like kind of intentionally throwing ourselves headlong into. And there are times where we say, okay, where it's at right now, I feel pretty good about it, but we're going to see in 6 months. We're not going to touch it for 6 months. We're going to go touch everything else, and then we're going to come back and we're going to say, okay, yes, this now must be different because of what has come out of the last 6 months of work. And like that process, I don't think it was codified, and I wouldn't say we're like super intentional about it, but we absolutely make room for that. And like what you were saying, Andy, like literally you are your best critic coming back to it after so long.
Lee, I saw a really interesting tweet of yours recently that I'll read from here. One of the best things about seeing people play the Cryptmaster demo has been how well it works with non-native English speakers, especially when they stream with a chat involved. It's almost educational, and then if people look it up, they can see a link to a VOD that a streamer was doing. I just wonder what obviously, you probably conceived of this game as sort of like English first, just because that's what you speak. But like, what is the relationship like watching people interact with this game as like non-native English speakers, interacting with mechanics that then let them interact with the language? Like, I'm just fascinated by what your journey has been watching some of this play out. Especially, it seems like you've been watching a lot of streamers.
Yeah, it's been an eye opener. It's something we didn't consider at first, really. How well it might work with streamers, but that's been an unexpected side effect, an unexpected bonus, really, from when the demo launched, to see how much people enjoyed playing it on a stream, because you can have the chat involved, asking you what happens if you type in this word, go on, try and type in this word, and so on, and helping to guess at the various skills. It's been really interesting to see that, and as I say, particularly with non-native speakers, how enjoyable it seems to be for a lot of streamers to play and have the chat involved as well. And even if their knowledge of English is not complete, I went back through after watching a lot of streamers, and I removed a lot of the words that I thought were more sort of slang words, because I thought this is it's a good opportunity to actually make a game that people can enjoy if they've got just a decent working knowledge of English. Obviously you would need that for a lot of the puzzles, but so I removed a lot of the things that were maybe more specific to native speakers, because unfortunately I would love to be able to localize it in more languages. I
was gonna ask. I was like, that seems like a month. Like, you need that game to be a big success to start considering localization.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we've got Spanish. We've got one additional language, but Spanish was, it was. I mean, I loved making it because language is kind of my thing. So I found the experience of doing the Spanish localization along with. My Spanish is very, very rusty, but along with some excellent Spanish game designers and localizers, we put the whole thing into Spanish, which was fascinating, really fascinating for me. And but it was a big job. Just things like immediately, I should have considered at the start that, of course, there's a 27th letter. Andy, you would know, obviously in Spanish they've got NEF as well. So suddenly we've got to break. I had to go to Paul and say, those like wheels of 26 letters and things that we've got at points in the game. I'm sorry, you're going to have to redo all that because we've got an extra one now coming in. So just things like that, and then most of the puzzles are all word-based, pun-based. There's a different letter frequency. You've got to be able to pick up letters from enemies to feed into your skill words, but of course. In Spanish or in any other language, letters come up at a different frequency, so we've got to rebalance everything to do with that. So it was a fascinating experience, but it took a lot of effort, and any additional language we do is going to take a similar amount of effort. So yeah, hopefully we'll be able to do some more languages because I really enjoyed the experience. But yeah, it's not a straight localization job at all. It's not a straight translation. You have to almost rebuild the game. I mean, the advantage, I was saying to somebody yesterday, the advantage if you can speak both Spanish and English is you've got two games for the price of one. Completely different answers, different skills for both languages. But yeah, It's a big job.
Evan, over the course of localizing like a Genesis Noir, did you run into similar sorts of? I feel like maybe you probably did. Of like, hey, here are our intentions here, but now we're localizing in other languages. This is giving us some pause. Like, was the experience similar?
I would say for Genesis Noir, it was relatively smooth in that you could just, because so much of the actual method in which the game tells its story is not reliant upon language, there was like a lot of looseness in localization that we could be okay with that would still end up, because really we were like, I want you to end up in this emotional space, but it wasn't ever essential to solving the puzzles or like finishing the game or even telling like some of the more salient, juicy beats of the story. Nirvana Noir, we're having a much different experience with that, where there are things like the butcher interaction in particular, and there's some stuff we want to do much later with like sentence construction that we look at doing. I mean, Romance languages they're not much different. It's not much of a problem, but as soon as we start looking at symbolic languages, anywhere in the Eastern languages, we have to really consider like how do we do something like the butcher? And I think unfortunately, like we absolutely are going to have to take the route where there are several other places where this happens, but we rely much more heavily on concept than we do on building individual words, because there isn't a way for that to function necessarily. There isn't a way for that to be like literally it's and this is actually really interesting because you end up with just like for sentence construction, for example, completely different syntax, but also like just a completely different feel for how even a sentence should come together, and how when you start appending different sides, like English is like really, really building blocky and really like weird and like functional. And a lot of the looseness that we want functions in English. But like I speak quite a bit of French and I've learned a bunch of Spanish, and like just the way that the sentence gets constructed and comes together and means something, even in a Romance language, which is like, you would think, not that bad, it's kind of a one-to-one, but like, when you start talking about especially rearranging sentences and moving words in between them and around it, not just the syntactical demands, but like literally the actual feeling of that sentence changes in just a very different way. So I sympathize, Lee. I'm actually blown away that you did Spanish already. I would be so curious to see what other languages function. Like I think German would be a really interesting challenge. Obvious for like very obvious building block reasons.
Yeah.
But then also I'd be curious like how you approach like Eastern languages, because I don't know how that would function. I don't know how like you'd end up having to rethink a lot of what you've done, because you end up with concepts as opposed to the much more granularized word.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I speak a bit of Chinese myself, and at one point it was requested, is it possible to do the game in Chinese? And I had to say, well, no, not really, because the whole, you've got the hangman, wheel of fortune sort of mechanic. Well, you don't. Yeah, in Chinese you don't make words like that. A word is a concept, as you say, essentially one character. So you can't play hangman in Chinese. You could do it in pinyin, I guess, but not really, because you miss the tones and things. So yeah, there are a lot of languages that unfortunately I think we'd have to. I just ruled out, really, unfortunately, because we could do it, but it would be a completely different game. The mechanics would just be. It wouldn't be a case of rebalancing it. It would just, you just have to do something entirely different.
Yeah.
Andy, with WanderStars, have you gotten far enough along to even conceptualize like how it's going to be interpreted in a different language?
Yeah,
like,
well,
does this are you just getting sweats as the two of them talk through this?
Actually, I think it would have to be like an entirely different combat system to allow for different languages, and this is something we've actually talked about. The problem actually lies in that the script right now has about 100,000 words, so that's going to be a very costly investment. So if we are going to localize, we're going to have to be very, very careful in choosing what language. I'm a native Spanish speaker, and I actually learned how to speak English by playing games. So the way we realized we could make it work was to keep the combat vocabulary so that the combat words would essentially stay the same, would have to stay in English, but we have an info box that has a description for all of the combat words. So all the text, all the dialogues would be in the respective localization. The combat words would stay in English, but then we would have descriptions in the respective languages for the players to, okay, so, this is a bunch, this is, it's going to have a description. And hopefully maybe they'll learn some English.
One thing I wanted to ask all of you as we work our way to the end of this panel is, obviously we're talking about narrative, we're talking about mechanics. What is a video game story that has really spoken to you? Whether it's informed the projects you're actively working on, or is just when you're asked, hey, when you think about a video game story, what springs to mind? Andy, I'm curious, what comes to mind when you were just prompted with a video game story that meant a lot to me?
Well, it's funny that I just said that I'm a native Spanish speaker, because the game that I learned how to speak English with was Paper Mario for the Nintendo 64. That was that was the first game I was like, okay, there's something going on here, because I'm actually a big Zelda fan and I play a lot of Ocarina of Time. But since it's a lot more actiony, you can just get away with just rolling around and you didn't have to pay attention to the story. But with Paper Mario, which is a more traditional RPG, there was so much text and so many characters, and I was like, okay, I need to figure out what's going on. So I would write the dialogues in a little note, and I would bring them to either my mom or my dad to hey, what does this mean? And then I would go back and play and then come back and how about this? So that went on for a pretty long while, and it actually helped me to start building my vocabulary. But more recently, a narrative experience that has resonated with me a lot is Night in the Woods, another indie game. Amazing game that just opened my eyes in the sense that what narrative games can be. Because I actually wanted to mention that when Evan was talking, that I feel purely narrative-driven games are so important right now. Because obviously we come from the perspective that gameplay is king, and the players are going to have opinions about the game and stuff. And of course, in platforms like Steam, you also have to think there's so many compromises, replayability and just keeping player engaged. And sometimes you don't feel that freedom, to just tell your story. So I just, with Night in the Woods, it was it resonated with me so much, and it was this is what it's all about.
Evan, how about you?
The one that really sticks out, and it's a pretty recent that I played Disco Elysium, but it just did everything I could have ever wanted a game to do. I play a lot of Dungeons and Dragons, and I adore watching a character come together over the course of 10 weeks, 12 weeks. And Disco Elysium beat me to the punch, and then also created such a massive world, and then just let you be the worst detective that you could possibly want to be. And watching that bundle of failures careen across the finish line, but also have all these other individual successes that were just so beautiful. Everything about it, and every one of the characters and the vocabulary and the choices, everything about that was the sinkiest, most happiest I could have ever been, bar none. And then the other two that are step downs from just the straight linguistic side would be Return to the Obra Dinn, which just got me so excited at so many opportunities. And that was a point where so much of it was performance, and it was in the writing was good, but it was also everything else that went along with that. And then those feelings, the extracurricular stuff, is typified in Ape Out, which I just picked up recently. And I can only play it for about 5 minutes at a time. But holy mackerel, story being told through that, and it being kind of almost a little generative story where you're telling yourself, I am the terrified gorilla, and and in this particular instance, I ran through and I had to murder 6 guards, or I completely hid the entire time because I was literally terrified, because that game just gives you this perfect claustrophobia in such a way. So, yeah, those are the three.
Lee, how about you?
Well, I think in terms of games that might have influenced Cryptmaster, I'm thinking now in particular. I'm going to really show my age now, but
all right, we're going to a bookshelf. If you're somehow you listen to this in podcast form on Remap, then I just want to point out that Lee just went to a giant bookshelf to grab some books.
To grab some old fighting fantasy books that I used to adore when I was a kid. And I mean, for Cryptmaster, the art style was inspired by the kind of the ink illustrations in these as well. And I often wish that game books had started in maybe the 1800s, or that we delayed video games for a while, because there were so many interesting things being done in game books, but just in that brief couple of decades. I know there are still some excellent ones being made now, but that brief couple of decades where video games weren't advanced enough to really to handle much in the way of interaction. But books, I mean, there were, what was the one by Joe Deaver, White Warlord and Black Baron, where there was basically an FPS, but inside books, so you would play it with somebody else, and you each have a book, and you say what codes are on each page, and you would see if the other player is crossing a corridor in front of you in a kind of FPS style. They were
That's
amazing.
incredible.
Yeah. So there was some,
I want to dig that up. I've never even heard of that, but that sounds
Joe
amazing.
Deaver, White Warlord and Black Baron, and that one, Arena of Death, is very similar. You could lay traps for each other. It's a 2-person game book, so there were some amazing things being done, and I would have loved to have seen how much further. Well, as I say, there are still some great game books being made, but they were a big influence on me. Chants of Sonar, I should just say, is one video game though that I've played just recently that I adored. So that's just fresh in my mind at the moment, and I think that's doing some similar to things to some of the games that we're making and discussing today. That's a great one. Curse of the Golden Idol as well. Sorry.
Oh yes, no, you're good. No, you're good. You can have one last interesting thought to share, and then now I'm gonna have to wrap the panel up. I'm getting my big red notifications, but I wanted to leave space, especially because all you've been so gracious with your time to point people to whether it's a Steam wish list or a demo they want to play. I want to make sure everyone gets pointed towards whatever is happening with your individual projects that you think people should check out. Andy, where do we point them for Wanderstars?
Yeah, just head out to Steam. The demo should be up right now, hopefully, and just give us your feedback. Maybe join us on Discord, and we'd love to have you there.
Great. Evan?
Same. We're going to be also having a demo on Steam by the time this happens. Also, you can find us on Kickstarter. We're trying really hard to entice players to be a part of this game the way they were in the first one, with maybe some more personalized pieces of that. So that's going to be launching in June, but you can wishlist us before then, and you can also follow us on Twitter to find out any of the updates along how that's going.
And Lee?
And yes, the same really. You can find us on Steam. There is a demo available now, and we're launching on May the 9th.
Excellent. Well, I am rooting for the game to be a big enough success that you were forced to make a Chinese version, and then you can come back and tell me how you did it. I need to find out. I feel like you set this gauntlet down where if the game is really successful, you're going to have to put it in other languages, and then it's just a whole new problem for you. So hopefully that happens. Hopefully all of your games experience the same levels of success. I want to thank all three of you for sparing your time and your thoughts about games, game mechanics, game design. This has been a wonderful discussion. We'll have to see if we can get everyone back together to do something again soon. But LudoNarraCon is ongoing. You can follow my work over at remapradio.com, and I'm across all the cursed social sites under Patrick Klupik. But thank you for joining us for this panel. Enjoy the rest of LudoNarraCon.